Right on. Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to pause for a couple of moments here to let the webinar populate a bit, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So let's just hold tight for a moment, and then we'll take off. While you're waiting for the start of the conversation, if you would familiarize yourself with the panel or the technology, if you go to the bottom of your screen in Zoom, there's a feature that allows you to chat. And so get familiar with that for a second, because we love our webinars to be as interactive as possible. And so in the chat thread, if you would put your name, maybe where you're calling in from, and if there's a pressing question that brought you to this webinar, I wonder what it is. So in the chat thread, your name, where you're calling in from, and if there's a pressing question that brought you to this webinar, we're really curious to hear what that is. So while you're doing that, my name is Jared Swigart, and I'm the co-founding director of the Global Immersion Project, and we're a peacemaking training organization. We're committed to forming people of faith into everyday peacemakers. These are folk who stand on a foundation of a restorative theology and understand how to live a faith in a way that fixes broken things on the planet. And so everything that we do is focused on raising our capacity to join God and one another in remaking the world. And so the beauty of this particular webinar is that the seeds of the Global Immersion Project were actually planted in the Holy Land, in Israel and Palestine, as John and I were traveling as a part of a learning delegation over there. And it was in that space that some of the internal longings and questions that we had about faith and about restoration, about peacemaking, started to spring to life. We heard ourselves voicing these questions to one another, and wondering about the connection between faith and peacemaking, asking questions like, are peacemakers born or are they formed? And being pretty convinced that we're formed, John and I began to ask questions about how would we form peacemakers? And that's really where our immersive approach to training everyday peacemakers was born. We thought that, if we want to learn about peace, let's go to conflict because it's the best classroom in the world. And if we want to learn about peacemaking, let's go learn from the peacemakers embedded in those conflicts because they're the best teachers in the world. And so our first ever immersive learning trip happened in Israel Palestine. And since then, we've run dozens of them over there, and many of you, no doubt, have traveled over there with us. And some of the panelists that you're gonna see today are our friends. They are a part of an international constellation of peacemakers who we are partnering with to actually generate a just peace. And so we're so humbled to have Shadia Kupti, Liel Magan, and May Elise Cannon on the call with us right now. So of course, that this is in conversation with the peace plan that was just rolled out called Peace to Prosperity. And when we saw this, of course, because we're so invested in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and specifically focused on how we raise the capacity of the U.S. American church to engage this restoratively, we just knew that this feels like a conversation that we need to have. We need to get some perspective. We need to get some good information. We need to get some lived perspectives. And then we need to get some more toeholds for how we actually move forward as U.S.-based people of faith. And so that's kind of how this conversation is going to go. So I want to, it's so fun to see so many familiar names and places literally from all over the country pop up on the chat thread. Keep doing that as you come in. Put your name, where you're from, and if there's a pressing question that you're wondering, pop it in there. I want to step out of the way, though, and let our three panelists introduce themselves. Obviously, they're coming from three different places with very unique perspectives, and so it's important for them to have an opportunity to articulate that a bit. And then we're going to dive right into the plan. So, Shadia, why don't you take us away?
Hello, everyone. So happy to be here with you today. My name is Shadia Kupti, and I'm currently in Jerusalem. So for us, it's a little after 10:30 p.m. So I'm happy to be spending my evening with you. So my experience, I come from an evangelical background. I was born and raised in Nazareth, pretty much in a Baptist church. And throughout my experience at the church, I became more involved in peacemaking and reconciliation work, coming from my vocational understanding of what does it mean to be a peacemaker in my context, and what is God calling us to do here. Um, that kind of changed a bit in terms of course, and kind of became more focused and zoom in into looking at who are the marginalized in our context, and how do we elevate their voices, especially that peacemaking in Israel Palestine context is kind of on the margins and has been for a very long time. That kind of led me to explore the context of women in that field more specifically, and also in both peacemaking and also in advocacy, and what do Palestinian Christian women and also women in that field have to say about different aspects regarding to their lives and how it affects it. So a lot of outcomes of that came into producing a lot of self-dependent initiatives relating to a podcast and blogging, really trying to create a platform for us to raise our voices and to talk about our lived experiences. So I would like to call it kind of a lived theology perspective of being here, of experiencing life in a context that's very complicated and very intertwined in each other's lives, and of course can't do that on your own. But even in my experience living in Jerusalem for many years, is that my neighbors and my colleagues and my friends are Jewish and Muslim. So in that interfaith context, what does peacemaking look like? How am I as a Christian, or how is my faith come into play in the day-to-day life, but also in the bigger spectrum of the conflict and in issues like that. Yeah, so excited to kind of be here and share with you some of my experiences, especially relating to the peace plan and also the current context.
Thanks, Shadia. May, let's go down to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jer. And thank you as well for creating space for this conversation. And I'm grateful to Shadia. We've known each other a long time. I'm a great admirer of her work and happy to meet you, Liel, as well. So I'm looking forward, as much as the conversation's a difficult one, I'm looking forward to having the conversation in the context of community. A quick introduction to me. My primary vocation has been as a pastor. I'm ordained in the Evangelical Covenant Church. And I say evangelical not in the political sense of the term, but in the sense of I love Jesus and I believe in the Bible, and I believe that God desires to see his kingdom come and the world to be a place where there is justice and where there's restoration and where the world can be made right, and the way that God intended it to be. And certainly the conflict in Israel Palestine and with the broader Arab world is certainly not according to the shalom and peace, that we aspire to, or that, our faith professes. And I certainly would say it's also not according to the will of God. But I come to you today. I'm the executive director of an organization called Churches for Middle East Peace. It's 30 member communions and denominations that are broadly ecumenical, inclusive of evangelicals, but has its roots in mainline Protestantism. We have participation from Catholic communions, from the traditional churches of the Holy Land, which are mostly Orthodox, Greek, Antiochian, Armenian. And so as the executive director of Churches for Middle East Peace, I can see the Capitol building from where I'm sitting right now in Washington, D.C. And so we'll talk about some of what this conversation looks like here. But I think, what we care deeply about is educating the American church, not just so that we can be better informed, but so that we can also be better disciples and better witnesses. And so in that regard, I'm looking forward to the conversation because I think the church actually, this is a critical moment for the church in terms of the way we respond to this moment in world history.
Spot on, May. It's an honor to have you on, and to know that you're in DC right now is really, it's a fascinating moment in DC in this very complicated conversation and time. And so thank you for you're going to be bringing some really important, very contemporary perspectives into
Thank you.
this.
And I should say, Jer, I apologize to everyone. I just had eye surgery and I'm hypersensitive to light. So that's why I'm wearing sunglasses. So apologies.
I was hoping you were going to say something because I didn't know if you wanted me to draw your attention to the fact that you're wearing sunglasses inside. But
I kind of forget.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I've been crying a lot about this deal. So
yeah, totally. Prayers for healing for your eyes. Leah, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. First, Jay, I want to thank you for inviting me. It's always great to be part of global immersion activities, and I see how this organization is developed, and it's a great privilege to be here. So thank you for inviting me. So I'm speaking from Jaffa, which is kind of the historic port city of Palestine, of this country, of Israel today. And it's now considered the southern part of Tel Aviv, for those that know better the location. I grew up Jewish. My parents immigrated to here from Italy and Libya. So I have kind of an history of Holocaust survivors and persecution in our country. And I grew up in a very right-wing family. And thus very much connected nationalistic perspective and camp in Israel for many years. However, in my army service, and especially after, many questions came up, mainly because of enduring PTSD and seeing my friends suffering from the service and understanding more about the impact of our presence in the West Bank and Gaza. And with time, I came to learn more about the history of the place and history of my family in Libya, and understanding better the general global dynamics that is happening in this region between European, American, or general colonial presence and the local people, and how this impacted the local conflict. I studied Middle Eastern studies and political science, and a master in international development, both in the Hebrew University. And today, over the last 5 years, I work in a center that tries to develop regional initiatives. It's called IPCRI, IPCRI, Israel Palestine Center for Regional Initiatives. And there we try to be more creative a bit in regards to how we analyze the regional conflict and how we suggest new policies and new projects that bring people together, and also try to answer the core issues that are at the core of this conflict.
Thanks, Leah. We welcome you three into this. Thank you again for bringing who you are and what you have into it. And to those of you who are listening in from across the country, thank you for making time to be a part of this conversation. We're gonna dive into it right now. I want to say that we want to be attentive as well to the questions that surface for you along the way. And so, as Haley indicated in the chat thread, if a question comes up for you along the way, please just write it into that Q&A feature. You'll see it right next to the share button. I'm not sure if you have a share button, honestly, but you'll see it down by the chat thread or the chat icon. Throw that question in there. And to our panelists, if you're not in the moment of actually presenting your perspective, if you would just keep your eye on what the questions are that are surfacing there for when we get to the Q&A portion of this. And so, May, we're going to start with you, just as someone who is deeply connected to this plan and has worked hard to develop an analysis of what it is that you're seeing. How do we make sense of the plan in general, and then what do you see as some of the highlights of it, and your perspective on how it is that we could or should be reading this?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to attempt to do a 5-minute summary of an 8-page document, 80-page document. So I'm going to skip a few things and go quickly. And I'm eager to talk a bit about our response at Churches for Middle East Peace and how I believe the church is called uniquely to respond. But here, I just want to give an overview. And I'm going to give an overview of what the plan articulates and our understanding of what that plan means. I will also say I was remiss in my introduction my background, I do have a PhD in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I often tell people, anyone who says they're an expert on this issue is a fool. So I don't self-identify as an expert, but I'm also often identified by others, as at least having education, experience, etc. So here's the main problem. What the plan says and what the plan means are really two different things. And so much of what the plan articulates sounds really good. Peace to prosperity sounds really awesome. And the economic differential between Israelis and Palestinians is quite significant. Years ago, the per capita income in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories of East Jerusalem and the West Bank was about 1/10 of Israel proper. So the idea that a significant part of this plan is economic actually is great, or it's great if it would allow self-determination, human rights, justice, and equality for all people. So some of what we need to do is to parse what's the plan say and what's it mean. And CMEP did a detailed analysis. You might be familiar, the economic portion of the plan was released months ago. And then what was just announced last week was kind of the more comprehensive picture of the political framing for the plan. So in my 4.5 minutes left, I'm going to highlight 8 points of this plan in terms of things that it says, but what that might actually look like. So the number one problem is that this is a plan that's being imposed and has been pre-agreed upon by the US government and the GOI, or the government of Israel. So the Palestinians were consulted only in preliminary meetings more than a year ago by Jason Greenblatt, members of the White House, US government officials, etc. So these meetings happened, but the Palestinians have never been viewed as an equal broker. They've never been at the table equally. So we were hearing months ago from government officials, etc., that this plan was a done deal and was in a drawer. So the other point we need to know is that the timing of the plan, which it was announced right in the middle of the impeachment trial of President Trump, the timing of the revealing of the plan is political as much as it is anything else. And so regardless of your political perspective, just the timing of it is quite significant. So the Palestinians were not invited to the table. The whole presupposition of a negotiated settlement is that the players need to be equally invited. And so that's point number one. It has to be negotiated between Palestinians and Israelis. The Palestinians had nothing to do with formulating this plan. And the plan also only allows Palestinians to negotiate and be invited into the conversation if they meet all of the preliminary presuppositions predetermined by the United States and Israel. So that's point number one. Point number two, we hear about this being a two-state solution plan, which has been one of the accepted political agreements or the framework of the political agreement. But actually, this is not a two-state solution of two viable states side by side. This would be a state that still would be largely controlled by Israel, or that would be, it's said that it would be a contiguous, or that it would be a connected state, but all that means is that roads in the West Bank that now are used for settlements would actually become the access roads for Palestinians between little tiny subsets of Palestinian areas. And so the idea that this is creating a viable future, for the economy and state of Palestine is really a misstatement. Number three, the plan calls for Palestinians to meet the challenges of peaceful coexistence, and then it defines what it means by that. It says the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. So the Palestinians have been recognizing Israel since the Oslo Accords, but this is actually acknowledging Israel as a Jewish state, which is problematic when you see the identity that 20% of Israeli citizens are actually Palestinian citizens of Israel. For example, dismantling Hamas, demilitarizing Gaza, and halting financial compensation to terrorists, which has been a major concern in US legislations with bills like ATCA, the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act, and things like that. The problem with this, it sounds great. We want Palestinians to use nonviolent resistance or to not violently respond. The problem is it's completely undefined in terms of what that looks like. So for the Palestinians to successfully meet the expectations that have been imposed upon them, which is problematic to begin with, there's not clear measurements. And so Israel or the United States could constantly shift what success looks like in that it's not defined. Number 4, Trump said under the plan that Jerusalem would remain the undivided capital of Israel, the Jewish capital of Israel. But then at the same time, he said that East Jerusalem would be the future capital of a Palestinian state. So again, that's actually our position at Churches for Middle East Peace. We call for a shared position for two peoples and 3 faith traditions, for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. But what this plan is talking about is actually the old city and all of the places that are the most desirable, or where the several hundred thousand Palestinians who live in Jerusalem are located, would be a part of the Israeli capital, and only surrounding suburbs or small Palestinian, really ghettos outside of the city, would be the future capital of a Palestinian state, which is not acceptable for the Palestinians, who see East Jerusalem and Al-Quds, the old city, as the sacred center of the future capital. And so this is contradicting. How am I doing? Do I have 2 more minutes? Okay, I'm going quickly, but I hope this is what you're looking for, Jer, in terms of parsing some of the main components. So I think I'm on number 5. You might be hearing in the news that this plan is calling for a settlement freeze. It is fundamentally not. There is no condition on, settlements not being continued to be built. It's talking about actually giving some territory that actually is not currently occupied by Israeli settlers. And for those who might not know, settlements are cities or communities that have been built by Israelis in land that has been designated to be the future of a Palestinian state. And this plan does not call for the halting of settlements. It calls for the halting of building in some of these areas, that have been deemed to be the future of a Palestinian state. Which I think is important to understand. And the great, great risk and fear is that this plan is legalizing, according to the US and Israel, the actual annexation of territory where settlements have already been built. And so that's one of the deep concerns. We saw that, and we'd have to hear from Liel and Shadia, who are actually on the ground. Last Sunday, I think the Knesset was going to vote, where there was some, I'm not keeping up with all of the daily activities in the Israeli government about the question of annexation, but we know it's at least a conversation that's happening in that regard. Number 6. And I write about this in a letter that we sent to the CMEP community the day this plan came out. The plan says no Palestinians or Israelis will be uprooted from their homes. And again, that's something that we all want. We want Israelis to have a prosperous future, for Palestinians to not have to worry about demolitions or displacement. But what that actually means is something very different than how that sounds. The way land laws work in Israel, and again, I would defer to Shadia and Liel, who would know much more than I, but the way the land laws work, this could allow for the contestation of even Palestinian citizens of Israel who are living in homes that they don't technically own because of land laws. And this could also, one of the conversations in the plan is the possibility that territory, the designation of the territory could be changed. So you could have people who are living on land that's currently a part of Israel that might become a part of the future Palestinian state. And so they would no longer be living in Israel because the categorization of the land has changed, even though they haven't been technically uprooted from their homes. Which is an important note to make. And then my last 2 points, this is number 7. The plan says the Palestinian refugee problem will be resolved outside of Israel. So one of the major requests of the Palestinian people is the right of return. And again, regardless of what you think the solution to that would be, that's at least one of the major negotiating concerns of the Palestinians. There have been UN resolutions that have been passed to protect the right of refugees and the right of return. And so the idea that issue is being taken off the table is problematic, just even according to international law. And then finally, the plan sounds great. $50 billion is going to be invested in a Palestinian state. Look at this, all this money, all these resources. But all of that money is going to be conditioned by the control that is stipulated by the Israeli, by Israeli control. So it's not actually independent money being invested in the future of a Palestinian state, which of course is quite problematic. So I will take a breath. I hope that wasn't too much. It's a broad summary, but I hope that's what you asked for, Jer.
Thank you. It's a stunning analysis of the plan itself. You referenced an 80-page document. Is the 80-page document your all's analysis of the plan?
No, I will actually drop it in the chat. It is the plan, the Peace to Prosperity plan itself, with all of the annotations, etc. My understanding is it's about 80 pages.
Yeah. Okay. Haley just pop that link, I think, for the actual plan in the chat thread. But and we'll continue to be in touch with you, the webinar audience, as May and others begin to develop these kinds of analyses. If those are helpful tools, if they're developing them, we're going to do our best to get them out to you all as well. And continue to, if you don't already, make sure that you're following the work of Churches for Middle East Peace, because these are the types of resources that they're developing for us. And so, May, thank you. Really, really, really helpful. Let's go over to you now, Shadia. In light of that analysis from a U.S. American Christian perspective on the plan, let's talk about your perspective on it and your lived experience, including the lived reality of this, your critiques, things like that. We'll take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I want to build on May, because some of my points I wanted to say also May touched upon, but I think the general response of Palestinians regarding this plan has been an array of emotions, whether it's anger, frustration, they're furious, grieved, further disempowered, unseen, dehumanized, unheard, and objectified. And I think this kind of represents kind of what is the sense of having read this and it being exposed to it, but also the press release that came of it, really the fact that no Palestinians were part of the decision making or the press release, it quite shows kind of it has kind of broken that mediation role that the expectation that the U.S. would have done. And it's quite sad to see the U.S. going that far with a plan that's really putting Palestinians in a state that's even imaginable worse than where we're at right now. So I just want to take a few points of looking at the actual peace plan. I mean, the actual plan is 180 pages, and the political framework is about 40 pages, and the economic framework is about 130. So it tells you how much weight has been invested in actual addressing the big issues that have been 100 years old compared to the incentive of let's put money in it. Money is going to solve the situation. Another thing is, and I think it's quite large from even some of the May's points, is this peace plan is all about real estate. It's all about property. It's all about what are we going to do with the land, and what are we going to do with. It hardly talks about people. Hardly addresses the aspects of addressing what does that mean for the people? What future is that for the people? Even the cover page, it's an image of buildings and land, doesn't even necessarily give you a hopeful or a motive, inspirational look beyond property. I think the language point is quite clear. I mean, if you read the actual plan and you think, well, it sounds fair. You have State of Palestine, you have State of Israel. And I think it's written in a very way that to make you think that it sounds fair. It sounds really nice. It sounds really good. This is all what we want. It does look like a peace plan. But even just looking at the glossary and looking at in depth each point, it just, by seeing the word State of Palestine in the glossary in page 1, it states, throughout the vision, the term State of Palestine refers to a future state, not currently in existence, that could be recognized by the United States only if criteria described in this vision are satisfactorily met. So you're not even giving equal grounds to both sides. There's delegitimization of Palestine as a nation, as those who deserve a state, only if criteria is met. And I think going beyond it, there's a lot of religious talk, a lot of religious sentiment in the document, even viewing the conflict as having two folds. One is territorial, and the second one, it's a religious dispute between Israel and the Muslim world. Knowing that the Muslim world doesn't necessarily, the majority of it is in the Middle East, but that's kind of the implication, or saying that it's a Jewish-Muslim conflict as well. So where does that put the Christians? What about me as a Palestinian Christian? Where am I in this conflict? There's no necessarily inclusiveness in it, and also refuse the notion that it's a clash of civilization conflict. Also, if you look at the two-state solution, I think this plan seals the end of a two-state solution. It's really talking about a one state, where one country or Israel dictates what that looks like for Palestinians. So it really puts an end to the idea of having a two-state if it was in existence. Recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. I mean, how many other countries have recognized Israel as a Jewish state? That's a big question. And again, the PA has recognized Israel already back in the 80s. So why is this being brought back again? And what does it mean to be a Jewish state? And how many other countries have done that as well? I think if you read the plan over and over, we are put in the person that we are the aggressors, we are the corrupt, we are the terrorists, we are the threats, we have lack of accountability. In any ways, we are looked over upon. We are considered we are considered the threat to the peace plan, and that's not really a place to come where you're saying we are both equal in many ways. And a lot of the talk when it comes to the state of Palestine, refrain, don't do this, take no action. Whereas Israel, it's more kind of you can build, you can expand, So there's a very different language used towards each side, which definitely doesn't make it a balanced view or looks at it from that perspective. Economic incentive. It seems like if you give money, you're going to solve the issue. That's what's the problem. And I think even the promise of an economic or prosperous future has some gaps in it. For example, creating over 1 million new jobs. It doesn't say what kind of jobs. Are they dependent jobs or independent jobs today? What does that look like in terms of addressing, creating a market or a Palestinian market for labor as well? And I think, if I were to summarize and have a look at it, I think I question what kind of future is this plan building for the Palestinians? And a lot of my friends, I was asking them how did they feel about the plan, and some of them are mothers and they have children, and they said, well, when the press release went out, my children were asking me, Mom, what does this mean? What does it say? And parents, she didn't know what to answer. What can you as a parent tell your child when two leaders dictate your future and tell you exactly how your future is going to be? It's quite sad to see where we're going with this. Even the press release, it was kind of an exhibition of a lot of masculine festivities, this very enthusiastic feel to it. And again, so many were excluded. Not only the Palestinians, I didn't see many women in the discussion. I don't know if the authors, there were some women. There was a lot of people not included in this press release or in this peace plan. And we need to question who isn't. We need to not only ask who is in the plan, but also who is missing in the plan. I think I'll stop here. I don't want to take too much time, but we can carry on this conversation as well.
Yeah, incredible analysis, Shadia. Thank you. Especially that last point on two questions being important: who was there and who was not included in this. And I want to come back. I want to come back in a little bit to that question, because I have heard I have heard so many say, well, why weren't the Palestinians at the table? And I haven't heard too many people asking, why weren't there any women at the table? I wonder how those two absences were related. And I'm wondering if we can maybe offer some commentary in a little bit when we get to Q&A on why the people who weren't at the table weren't there. For those of you who are listening to this through the lenses of everyday peacemaking, thinking about thinking about the process of building peace and the collaborative approach to this, we always have to be asking the question, who has to be sitting around this table in order for a just peace to emerge? And so I'll put a pin in that. We'll come back in a second. Liel, why don't you offer multiple perspectives, including your own from a Jewish Israeli point of view?
Yeah, thank you, Jer, and thank you, May and Shadia. It was great listening to you and give a good, very important analysis. I think I would like to start with presenting kind of a general perspective from the Israeli public, and then maybe I'll go to my analysis. And I'm not sure if our audience here, all of them came with your trip to the country. So just say in general that for understanding the Israeli political map is really understanding those that just want to have a state, a nation that is legitimate and recognized in the world, and those that want to reconnect to the biblical territory. And this is very important because then you can understand clearly the reactions or reactions to the plan. And if we look at the reactions, we see that the camps are splitting very clearly in those two points. I looked and I saw right-wing broadcasters and journalists and activists and representatives that their reactions to the plan was that finally the Israeli or the Jewish connection to the West Bank is recognized internationally. And this is something that was a bit absent from international analysis that I saw, that the most important thing for the right wing in Israel for the last 50 years was to have an international actor that recognizes our presence in the West Bank as something legitimate. And this plan is the first time that such important step is happening. When I tried to ask them about the two-state solution, they told me there won't be a two-state solution. It's just another discussion that will enable us to postpone this question for unforeseeable future, especially as the Palestinians are continuing to refuse any plan that is offered. Meaning not only that our presence in the West Bank is recognized and legitimate, but also it gives us another excuse to continue with the status quo that at the moment it creates a situation where Israel is the powerful side and can make decision on its own without discussing anything with Palestinians. So that's from the right wing of the Israeli society. From the left wing, something very interesting happened that I saw many campaigners from the central left and the left, from the Labor, Meretz, etc., trying to prove to right-wingers that we are back to Oslo process. In a very interesting way, they said that the plan is very similar to Oslo, and those that incited against Rabin needs now to apologize, because finally we are back to Oslo. There were those even said that a few years ago when Trump had the famous speech or the famous answer where he said, one state, two states, it doesn't matter as long as they agree on something, if I recall well. So if we were in a point where all solutions were on the table, now we are back to two-state solution. And it's something that the left wing emphasized. And for them it was important because it was kind of a proof against the right wing that no matter what, even if we will have the most supportive president in the US, we still need to compromise on land and have a two-state solution. Besides those camps that I can say are between 80 to 90% of the Israeli public, you had, let's say, the human rights organizations, the leftist organizations, so those that believe that Israelis and Palestinians should be equal in this land, that gave another point of critique by saying that this is not an agreement, this is not a solution. You cannot call a peace process a plan for peace. Peace is not something that you plan, but something that you create and do with two sides on the table. And it was the major critique, and there were several demonstrations against the plan, led by the Israeli human rights organizations, by saying that it's not a peaceful agreement, it's not a peaceful plan, and with an amazing and interesting slogan that says, let's not make apartheid great again, which is mainly saying that this plan is not really recognizing the rights of the two people, but maintain a superiority on one side on the other. But that's, of course, I can say between 5 to 10% of the Israeli public at the moment. Another important point that was emphasized and wasn't brought up until now was a section in the plan that says that the triangle, which are few villages in central east of Israel that are Palestinian by identity but have Israeli citizenship, it's been said in that section that there will be a possibility of them to be connected to the Palestinian state and their citizenship to be revoked. And this created a lot of turmoil in the Israeli left party about putting a question mark of a citizenship of around 250,000 of people, and really deciding for them in which state they want to be in. So that's in general, the general analysis for it. I must say that in my point of analysis, I see very interesting things that are happening here. And it's, first of all, it's the politics of humiliation. And there are different scholars that are speaking about it, Michael Sandel, that we are moving beyond politics of rationale to a field of humiliation. And in that binary field, you are humiliating or you are humiliated. And we are creating a discussion where we cannot find a middle way. It's or you are a victorious or you are a loser of the situation. And we can see in this plan that the real purpose of it was to humiliate the Palestinians, to kind of create a situation where they will feel that they lost. They lost this competition and they just need to give up. And the fact of them not being even invited on the table was the part of this humiliation. With the reactions of the right wing is also something that come up. The idea of from two recognized parts to one side that is fully recognized to the other side that is fully not. You're basically humiliating the other side and showing that you are now the only one that is victorious in this game. The other point for me that was very interesting was the continuation of a unilateral approach since 2005, basically. Maybe let's say from Camp David of 2000, where the last real attempt for negotiations collapsed. We see mainly unilateral approach towards solving the conflict. This created disengagement from Gaza, the creation of the wall in the West Bank. Even afterwards, Olmert was elected by another plan of retreating from the West Bank, but negotiations are not on the table anymore as a potential for solution. And this plan again showed another unilateral approach towards creating solution in something that's very arbitrary. It's very imposed. And it's a question here if this is a way that you can really create peace. I know there is someone here in the call that says that he's from Sarajevo. In the Balkans, we see a very interesting case of arbitration and international involvement to try to separate the sides and create a binational kind of state in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But it's interesting that here the international intervention was very one-sided, and it's a question what will be the response to it. And we see already in the last 24 hours that there were violent attacks towards it as a response, and I hope there won't be another violent escalation. I don't know if I have enough more time, but I have another point that I want to mention. Maybe yeah, a few more minutes. Okay, so my last point would be about what equality is. And I think it's something that we all should think about. It seems that in the last 30 years, the main idea or the main point of analysis of equality was the idea of equality between nations, and not so much equality between individuals or communities. It seems that if we create two states with right for self-determination for each, we are solving the conflict, but we are not really engaging enough with other questions that arise from it, and its imbalance of power, historic trauma, connection to land, connection between communities, culture, economics, human rights. All of these are not being brought up at the table when we're all the time discussing the two-state solution. And I think we should all ask ourselves if the nationalistic agenda is the right agenda to solve the conflict between communities that are so much intertwined and so much live side by side for many, many years. Maybe there are other frameworks that can be initiated for solving it. Maybe a confederation, maybe a multinational open borders framework. Maybe let's take a step back and start with equality, freedom of movement, human rights, and then we'll move towards the states. But we are too much focusing on the national point of view of the conflict and forget the human daily life within this territory. Yes.
Thank you. I'm glad that you brought up that last bit. You know, we could have a whole nother webinar, I think, on the emergence of national identity and this competition for what you say is a competition that has resulted in a shift from a politic of rationale to a politic of humiliation. I think that is so well put, what you've said there. There's so many other things that you all have brought to the table here as well that literally I want a webinar series out of like the 8 things that have raised to the surface for me. Understanding that that our audience is largely identifies as Christian. I know one of the questions that they're asking is how are we supposed to respond to this as Christians? Because so many, especially groomed within American evangelicalism, have been taught to understand Israel as an expression of a contemporary expression of an ancient Israelite and like the promised people and the promised land and all these things. And so they're watching Christians who are celebrating this. Those of us who are maybe self-aware are starting to go, why aren't other Christians celebrating this? Why is there a differing of opinion on this even within the Christian world? Which raises the question, how has Christianity been actually commodified as a pawn in this? And so let me ask that question, and before we then talk about what is the opportunity of this moment. So I'd love to hear you 3 interact with that. How is Christianity being commodified as a pawn, and how do you see it being used? May, can we start with you?
Sure. I'll jump in. You know, the verse we've been talking about at CMEP is from Jeremiah 6:14, and it says, "They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace." I mean, for those of us who choose to follow Jesus, we say often, you know, light shining in the midst of darkness. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Like, these are images that are so important in our faith. And I think one of the things, again, regardless of if we identify as Republican or Democrat, like from a nonpartisan perspective, as followers of Jesus, the witness of Jesus is at stake. And so I write about this in this letter, and I just thought I'd read it because I think it's the most concise articulation I can give you. What's happening is the use of Judeo and Christian imagery, religious and spiritual imagery, it's being used to justify political gain. It's being used to justify politics. And that at its like baseline is idolatry. So referring to the modern geopolitical nation state of Israel with all of these biblical ideas, you know, Israel, President Trump in his announcement said Israel is a light unto the world. And I think the modern nation state of Israel is very, very different than what we read about in the Hebrew scriptures and the Jewish people. And so this kind of use of political imagery and language is just deeply disconcerting, particularly when we're not seriously addressing injustices suffered by those who lived for decades under occupation. And so as we look at the scriptures, we're taught, care for the least of these, respond to those who are poor and oppressed, pay attention to the widows and orphans. And so just from a Christian discipleship paradigm, you know, part of what's happening with this administration in Washington, D.C. is they're justifying the confiscation of land. And they're saying, look, all these pastors are in the room with us. The evangelical church, the Christian church, you know, supports us. And so that's idolatry. And then people who are not Christian look and say, look, all these Christians are unilaterally supporting this plan, which is essentially seeking to annihilate the self-determination and presence of millions of Palestinians. Which, you know, I think if we're not convicted by that, we absolutely should be.
Thanks, May. How would you interact with that, Shadia?
I think as a Palestinian Christian living here, growing up here, you always feel out of sync with the at least as an evangelical, with the evangelical West, because my mere existence, I have to pay the price. I have to live with the consequences of decisions made right now in the U.S. And supposedly supported by evangelicals. And all of the church leaders here have condemned the peace plan, have spoken against the peace plan, but we don't feel we've been heard. We don't been acknowledged, taken into consideration. And again, our mere existence, our presence here, we believe we have been the custodians of the church throughout the centuries, and our mere existence kind of breaks that binary view of two sides, Jewish and Muslim world view, as if Christians are on one side. But my history, my experiences, my lived theology here has been, how do I interpret the Bible? How do I be a peacemaker? How do I implement the ministry of reconciliation that God called me to do in a context that's driven by conflict? Is it by taking what does peace look like for me? And I think when we come out and we say we want peace, we want justice for all of a sudden to realize that that's not necessarily interpreted the same way, it raises big issues, and we have to advocate for that by what we are walking the walk of Jesus. Jesus was constantly saying to walk with the poor, speak for those who, you know, bless all the Sermon on the Mount, that we empower those that are disempowered. We speak for those who don't have a voice. And so for my context, it's quite clear what that means and where that position is. But outside, it's being misused in the complete opposite. And that creates a big tension and a big misunderstanding of how do we then communicate that? How do we then challenge our own misinterpretation or different interpretations of what we are called here to do from that perspective?
Thank you, Shadia, for that. Liel, why don't you weigh in from your point of view?
Yeah, I'm not Christian, so I'm not. I won't speak from a point of faith, but I'll say that some people will argue that the dichotomy of the Iron Wall or the Cold War between the West and the East, or Soviet Union and what's being perceived more liberal or capitalistic states, transitioned to a clash of civilization of US-dominated spaces and Islam or Islamist. And we can see all these different battlefields within it. And now it's being transitioned a bit to a more specific country, and it's Iran. But within this dichotomy, Israel is kind of a fort within the Middle East of this West, perceived West, within this Arab-Muslim space. And this gives Israel a lot of leverage. And it enabled Israel to ignore many of the international laws because it's being this fort in the middle of this battlefield. And what I want to say by it is that maybe the main question is how we dismantle this war in the US, how Islam is not being perceived anymore as an enemy, or how the Arab person is not being perceived anymore as the enemy. Maybe the war should, or the reconciliation of this war should start in the US, especially in this clash between Christianity and Islam that has many implications and manifestations in this country. Especially if we look at evangelical Christianity, we have the new wave of the new crusaders and the whole idea of bringing the Messiah back on the second coming through creating another clash with Christ and Antichrist, etc. And many times in these lenses, the Islamists, the jihadists are those that are being portrayed as those to fight with. And I wonder how we can create an interfaith discussion already happening in the US with evangelical Christians that will lower the flames over there that are one of the origins. I don't know if our audience know, but the right wing in Israel is supported very much by evangelical Christians in the US. And many of its fuel wouldn't come up without this strong support. Also, the Trump plan or the Trump declaration of the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel was supported very much by evangelical Christians. And in the ceremonies, there were famous preachers and pastors present in the room. The most famous one is, of course, John Hagee, which they intensify the conflict and intensify these steps that are very one-sided. And I wonder how Christianity can create a new discourse that is more peaceful and more try to create peace and not to intensify conflicts.
Excellent, excellent. I want to use that then, and for those of you who have been posting some questions, our panelists are going to start to maybe interact with those in somewhat in conversation here. Otherwise, they're going to try to address it a little bit in the actual feature. We're going to probably go just a few minutes over because obviously the pressing question is what to do. What do we do about this? I was on a conversation earlier this week where someone offered analysis by saying, yeah, you learn more about this, but the writing for this was on the wall. Like, we need to continue to learn about these things, but this plan is just a kind of a reorganization of something that has been in the works for a long time. And so, yes, let's learn more. And this conversation obviously is a part of that. But from your three perspectives, wherever there is a moment of chaos or crisis, there's an opportunity there. And I wonder how you would reflect on the opportunity, specifically, again, speaking to our audience who are people of faith who want to follow Jesus in a way that's restorative. What is the opportunity of this moment, and what are the things that we can do? Liel, like you just said, how would you encourage this group of people to create or to begin to change the dialogue, especially within American evangelicalism, with regard to this conflict? Liel, could we start with you, and then let's move to Shadia and then May?
Okay. I think I stressed the point of the discussion should start already in the US regarding the relations to other religions. But another point that I want to make is that we can see a rise all across the world of hatred, of nationalistic hatred, of ignorance, of neglection of complexity. And I would like really to stress and ask not to do the same. It's very easy now to hate Israel or to become an anti-Semite and saying that Jews are controlling the world or controlling the US government. And then we are feeding into the same pipeline of problems, of superficiality, of politics of humiliations, of this binary discussion that we want to avoid. So I think the first thing that we should do is to manage to live with complexity and not having very clear answers, and trying to model a place where we can understand both sides and understand complexity and try to live with it and understand that the world is complex in many ways. And within this, to be able to absorb and hold and live with different perspectives, different cultures, different way of living, different faiths, and understanding they complement each other. And we all need to find a way of living in the same space together and not to fight and defeat each other. So this is like regarding role modeling and how we should behave. And within this, we should highlight perspectives that are usually being ignored and try to challenge people that see it one way or the other. They can be pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, but see it very, very one-sided or very superficial way, to try to challenge them and expand their perspective. and support those that try to do it, of course.
You know, I can make a distinction between U.S. policy and U.S. foreign policy and Americans. There's a big difference there because of relationships built and people that have Americans that have come here, especially from church groups and stuff like you, Jer, and the group that you do. We build relationship, and it's getting to know our stories. It's getting to know our lives, not just as representatives of our peoples, but also as what has God put on our hearts, each and every one of us. And I think now more than ever, the situation Israel Palestine is in your hands. You are accountable for it in some ways. This peace plan, you are deciding more about my future than I'm deciding about it because of what's coming out of this peace plan. And I want you to feel accountable, responsible, that change happens with you. You can make a difference. And hoping that these relationships that we've built, these this knowing my story, knowing where I come from, hearing my heart's desire for peace here, will motivate you to do something about it. Because right now the decisions are made in your country, not here. But I have to stress that its implications on my future and the Palestinians' future is very real and it's very strong. And so I feel like this is kind of the best way for me to tell you whatever that looks for you, and that you understand your context more. And I am hoping your can help kind of give more solutions to it. But please bear in mind you have a precious responsibility on your hands. And as much as this was done, you can undo it as well.
Yeah, thank you both, Shadia and Leo. I agree. I so appreciate hearing you say we can make a difference, Shadia. One of the things I've been saying this year is that despair is a luxury of the privileged. And if you don't give up hope, how can we? So thank you for that encouragement. You know, I think for Christians, and I'll speak specifically for Christians living in the United States, what's being reported about the media is that 80+%, particularly of white evangelicals, but white Christians in general, support this administration. And again, I'm not trying to speak about the broader kind of political landscape, but what's being said about many of us who care deeply about this issue is not a whole picture or a holistic picture. And so one of the things that we are most responsible for is I've been saying, what's our witness? And so what's that look like? It looks like blogging about it. It looks like, how many of you live in towns that have a small newspaper? I grew up in Calvert County, rural Southern Maryland. This newspaper will print anything that comes from someone from Calvert County, right? And so write to your local county paper and tell them, until we have until we have a peace plan that addresses the needs of both Israelis and Palestinians, we'll never have peace. And I'm a Christian and I love Jesus. And when President Trump says Christians are supporting this, I'm saying I do not. I think that's the number one thing we can do. And so if you want to get more involved in the political advocacy side of things, we don't yet have an action alert on this. We will in the next several days. So we have action alerts where we can give you letters, and you could call your elected officials and write your elected officials. And if you come to DC, we'll set up meetings with your elected officials, or at least their staff. So we're happy to do all of that. But the first and most immediate thing is, if you don't agree, say you don't agree. And so CMEP's been getting all kinds of amazing notes and letters, and we've asked people to pray with us. We have this Prayers for Peace blog. You can post your prayers there, but then share it so other people know you don't agree, so that we can try to at least change the identity of how Christians, again, particularly conservative Christians and evangelical Christians, but to say, hey, I identify as a Christian and I don't think this is right. And it's not because we don't love the Jewish citizens of Israel, or we don't acknowledge. I so appreciated, Leo, you talked about one of the most significant things of this plan was acknowledging the significance of the West Bank to Jewish culture and Jewish heritage. And my understanding is Jewish religious identity. And I think we can acknowledge all those ties without saying that we support a plan that means the Palestinian people need to be disenfranchised, right? And so to reject this zero-sum game mentality and to assert that if there ever is going to be justice, if there's ever going to be peace, it has to be peace for both Palestinians and for Israelis.
Excellent. Thank you, the three of you. What an unbelievable privilege to have access to you and to your perspectives, to your thoughts on this. It is so incredibly helpful. I have pages of notes. I'm sure that so many of the rest of us do as well. There's from our point of view, there are two, maybe three things that are on our mind with regard to this. Number one, if you understand yourself as a faith leader on this call, we want to encourage you to utilize this tool to spark some more conversation within your team, within your sphere of influence. And as someone who is groomed with a particular theology and a particular understanding of Israel Palestine, I just didn't have access to other kinds of thoughtful analyses like this. And it's the fodder of conversation that we need. We need to ask some questions about how our understanding of eschatology, or how it's all going to end, is informing the way that we're getting behind something here. And if the way that we're getting behind something here is actually causing the oppression and occupation of another group of people, we have to ask ourselves some serious questions about our understanding of God. If we see ourselves disregarding the dignity and the humanity and the image of God and other people, we have to ask some questions about our understanding of humanity and our theology of relationship. And we have to ask ourselves, do we really think that Jesus meant what he said when he said things like move beyond loving your other to loving your enemy? I mean, we have to have serious conversations, and not just theological heady ones, but like, how is this actually playing out in the lives of our families, within the lives of our faith communities, within the lives of our organizations, our universities, and so on and so forth. So I'd encourage you to utilize this as a tool. We always send this out, and you can grab it and please leverage that. The second thing is that these three, they're friends of mine, and they are significant in shaping my theology, my lived experience of what's going on. As I was reading through this plan, I'm thinking about the perspectives that I would imagine these three have, and I knew that they would offer so much important input for us to then take into our own lives. We have to become people who build relationships beyond borders and boundaries, and we have to learn how to do that. That is a discipleship issue. One of the ways in which Global Immersion does that is through our immersive learning trips, and so we do this multiple times a year, where we're building delegations of people like you, and we're bringing you with us into the epicenter of this, where we can actually now sit in a room with people like Shadia and Liel, where we can actually read from the brilliance of May's writing and reflection on all of this, as it seeds our understanding of this in a much more robust way. And so we want to invite you to come with us. This is a time to get proximate to this. And Global Immersion, through our immersive learning trips, that's what we do. We want to expose you to this, so that you can come back and live, love, and lead as everyday peacemakers back in this space. And so we've got one coming up in November 8 through 15 is our next immersion trip, with some open spots. And we want to encourage you to take advantage of that. Now's the time to come with us. Friends, we believe that peace is what God waged in Jesus. We believe that peacemaking is not an add-on to faith. It's central to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And that means that we actually have to show up in these moments and do so restoratively. And so we encourage you to take your notes that you took here. For those of you who understand yourself as Christian, ask the Spirit to roam untamed in this time, in the aftermath of this call, and to awaken you to some of the next steps that you can take. You're going to get an email from us with all of the resources that they talked about, including access to the podcast that Shadia has been facilitating, raising the voices of female perspectives, especially in the West Bank, and many of the links that May has referenced as well. So we bless you, and friends, let's move boldly and with courage in the way of formation for the sake of restoration. We'll see you next time on our next webinar. Take care.
Thank you, dear.